Thank you so much for having me. This is by far the coolest setup I've had for one of these presentations. Usually they put us on the ground level and we maybe get a bit of light, but this is unbelievable. So I was taking some pictures. I kind of want to take a selfie here to share with my colleagues. I'll do that at the end. So thank you so much for having me. This is super, super cool. How many of you guys have heard of Quelles? A good handful of you. Okay, good. So, we're an urban design practice. We're based in Copenhagen, and about 6 years ago, we opened offices in New York and San Francisco as we started to see an increased demand in North America to create cities for people. And that's really our focus. We start with people. That's the starting point of any design decision we make. So before we start to draw a public space or come up with a strategy for a master plan, we really want to start with this understanding of what the public life of a place is. Understand what the pulse of a city, a neighborhood, a place, a future site's public life is. And when we talk about public life, really, it's sort of the currency of a great place, right? It's shaped by these micro moments. It's these small daily interactions between people. It's a shared experience. It's a glance, a smile. It's civic and demonstrations. It's also everyday. It's sociable in community. It's interactive, but it's also intimate and quiet. It's planned events, of course, and it's also the spontaneous. It's what you love to do, and it's what you have to do. But really, it's what we create when we live our lives outside of our homes, offices, and cars, right? It's what we create when we're invited to discover, participate, connect, shape, and share experiences together. So this sounds all great and good, right? But why do we really care about this? Because for us, as we start to understand this, we understand, that this all feels good, but it's actually more than just nice to have. There's some real tangible benefits to making public life an intentional driver to the way we shape, design, and plan our cities. A lot of cities have these big banner issues, right? Social isolation, economic development, healthy city, community cohesion, these big, big banner issues. And actually what we realize is if you start to make public life, the public life outputs, the driver of your city, you're going to start to hit and tick off all of these key big issues. So I think one that we all are kind of aware of is physical health, right? If you live in a more compact, walkable city, you're automatically going to have a little bit more of a healthy lifestyle. There's studies that show that just by living in a walkable, compact neighborhood, you increase your weekly physical output by 90 minutes. Not by going to the gym, not by trying. It's just automatically sort of part of your lifestyle. But other elements too is mental health. I think if we start to see this idea of social isolation is becoming more of an issue, loneliness is becoming more of an issue in our cities, and this sort of, again, these compact, walkable neighborhoods, we're starting to find improvements in our sense of social isolation, in particular with elders. Neighborhoods that are walkable and connected see fewer declines in mental acuity and Alzheimer's. And actually we're seeing a 30% increase in the risk of early mortality in socially isolated neighborhoods. Happiness and well-being. I think this is another one that, there's some statistics that are coming out, kind of talk to this, but really what it boils down to is the less time that you're commuting to work, the more time you have to do what you love to do. One statistic that I thought was kind of interesting and kind of incredible was that they're finding that removing 1 hour from your commute produces the equivalent happiness of a 40% increase in pay. So, if you just get closer to work, it's like you've got a nice raise. Social equity and social cohesion. This is becoming more of a need in our neighborhoods and our cities as they're becoming more diverse. They're becoming more dense. These public spaces are the platforms to kind of bring people together. Public safety and sense of security. I think really this is about eyes on the street. So we start to see again as you have that eyes on the street, it's a safer neighborhood. And then greater environmental sustainability. We're just seeing now that transportation tops power generation as the primary source of emissions in our cities. So again, walkable, compact neighborhoods start to hit this. These are just some quick headline data points to really get to the point of that. You make a walkable, compact downtown. You put public life as your driver. You're going to start to, hit many birds with one stone. And really, what it comes down to is vibrant places attract and retain people. And another kind of angle to this is that people more and more want experiences over stuff, over things, right? Interaction, learning, surprise, delight, belonging are what we're craving. Transactions, buying stuff, is not. So this is another piece to creating a city that is more focused around these experiences rather than transactions. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about here is our methodology around how we study public life. So really, it's pretty straightforward, but making spaces that are good for people means understanding people. It's not rocket science, but it's amazing how few cities actually have a methodology around studying people. So if we pay attention to people, they adopt a space. If we don't pay attention to people, they will not adopt it. So this designer really wants us to kind of walk in like this motion here. But they're going to want to do the connection through. So, and I think there are examples of design that really already understand this, right? User experience design, this phone, this iPhone, who has this thing? Who has an iPhone in here, right? How addictive is that thing? It's been meticulously designed with people first metrics in mind. So it is designed for us to be addicted to it, and sometimes that looks like this. And so looking at cities then, do cities really understand people? Cities are really good at documenting the stuff in cities, the infrastructure, the bits and pieces, right? They have data on how many benches are there, how many lampposts are there, the crosswalk signal timing, potholes, bus stops, the amount of pigeon poop in a city, right? There's all this data around this stuff. They also have super sophisticated systems to collect data on traffic, on cars, on volume of cars. But there's so much, in a way, they're a lot less comprehensive about how they document people's experience and use of a city. So when we're planning something, if we have a lot of sophisticated data around the infrastructure, around the cars, the outcomes are going to reflect that. We're going to see, hey, this is where we started with this. There's a traffic jam here, and we can improve the commute by this way, and we're going to have more cars on the street. But if we don't have data around people and people's experience, we can't really set a baseline to move forward. We're just going to say, hey, it should be this, or it would be nice if it was that. But we need to start to collect more of a baseline data to move the needle forward on this. So this is where we really fill in the gap, and where this book, translated now, kind of helps sort of open that up a little bit. This is a key piece to what we do. And there's a sort of suite of methods here. I'm not going to go into all of them tonight, but I'll talk through a few of them. Things like social media analysis are interesting, interviews and intercept surveys, but one of the key things that we really focus on is observational analysis. And just to kind of quickly go over a very high level of what we do, it's not rocket science, but what we do in every city that we go to before we come up with any designs is we understand how are people moving through the city. Really simple, and be methodological about it. So it's really about what the volume of people is on foot and bike, what's their age, what's their gender, what direction are they going to, how long are they spending time doing that. Same thing for staying. How are people invited to stay or not stay in this space? And what is their posture while they do it? Are they standing? Are they sitting? Are they lying down? And we can start to infer some stories based on this. So, for example, lying down, I was making a joke earlier that if we see a lot of people lying down in a space, it could be that they had a really crazy night the night before. But more often, I think in a lot of public spaces, it indicates that people feel really safe and comfortable in a space. So if you're in a great park that people are lying down, there's lots of different postures. It's a very dynamic and inviting space to as many people as possible. Same thing with group size. So if we're seeing a place that a lot of people are individual in a space, there might be something there that works. Maybe it wants to be kind of a quieter, more intimate space. But if we want a more sociable space, places that are seeing groups of 3 or more are kind of facilitating that. So again, this is just some examples of how we look at that. And then, so there's space in terms of how we move, how we stay, and then spatial quality is another key piece. So how is the space responding to the use in that space? So we want to look at how safe it feels, how comfortable it feels, and then on the final layer is how enjoyable is it? What's the delight of a space? We have this kind of 12 quality criteria that kind of gets into what we see as the key qualities of good public space. And they're fairly straightforward, and in a way, they sort of respond to our physiology, right? In a way, we're all about the same height in kind of a general range. We all take in the world through our senses for how we smell and how we hear it. We take in the world at about a 72-degree angle, which means that first floor is super important, because that's what we sort of see when we experience the world, right? And so a street like this, a main street, innately feels good, because we need about 1,000 stimulations every hour to feel good. That's about 1 stimulation every 4 seconds if we're walking at about 5 kilometers an hour. So a good street like this has a rhythm of 4 seconds. There's an interaction that's stimulating my brain that's making me feel good as I go through it. So just an example. So then this wall could be the most beautiful granite or marble ever. But we're going to walk by that faster and think that it took longer. And then something like this, fairly scrappy, actually feels really nice. It's sort of satisfying the stimulations in our mind. Other methods that we use are really, really important are engagement. But this idea of popping up and engaging in space, meeting people where they are. So not necessarily inviting people to an event, although you guys are proof that you can get a big group together to talk about this stuff. But a lot of times people don't have time to do this stuff. So we're really, we feel really strongly about finding creative ways to get out into the city and talk and engage people using language that anybody can understand, from a 4-year-old to, to like an urban planning PhD student, right? So really important to kind of understand all these age groups and meet people where they are. Intercept surveys is another tool that we use. I won't belabor this too much. Sometimes we'll set up a little public office in a space and not necessarily be soliciting people, but just hang out there for a while and let people come to us and have conversations with people on their time. All this data, sensors can help. And of course, we're talking with different sensor companies to collect this data. But the key here really is that observation is key. It's super important. I love this picture, just pausing on this picture for a minute, because there's a quite nice bench here, but this guy is sitting in this little nook by the door here. And trying to think about this, if you spend any amount of time outside, spend an hour or two outside, it's a blast, I promise, looking at a space, you're gonna see all these little quirks in a city. All these little things are happening constantly. And so you might kind of think about this. If there's a pattern here, if there's a rhythm, what's going on? Is it that there's a nice place here for him to rest his Coca-Cola? Does he feel more connected or more protected from, this window is on looking and he might feel a little bit exposed? So there's all kinds of quirky little things like this that happen in a city, and that's why spending time in the city observing is super important, that a sensor sometimes doesn't always get. There are these little counter spaces back here, but everybody's hanging around the newspaper stands, right? Again, I think another example like this, in a traditional planning process, this is a map, that's a pedestrian, and they're kind of walking through this space, but if you kind of land on this space and you can really feel the experience, it's pretty undignified, right? It's not a great experience. Maybe we should put some benches here. There probably is a better detour, but people have just kind of fashioned their own little bridge across this too. So I could spend a lot of time going through these images. These make me smile. But it's all to say that we appropriate space as we need it, and designers sometimes ignore how people actually want to use space. So we take a lot of this data, this observational data, the life and the space, and we look at it at different levels, from the individual level to the network level. And this starts to enter into our database, where we've studied cities in over 250 cities, different scales of cities, of course. And we start to visualize and sort of draw out some stories from this data. I'll flip through a few examples of how we do that, how we collect and pull data together. This is just a little appetizer of that. And then I'll share a couple of examples that I'll go into in a little more depth. The key thing with data is we can go out and collect tons of data. There's so much data in the world that we're pulling in and absorbing. The point for us is really understanding, what do we want to understand? Is it that we want, I think, for example, you could look at a space and say, we need 40 more playgrounds, right? Or do we want 20% more kids under the age of 14 spending time there? Those are two different ways of asking that question, right? So it might not be 40 playgrounds might not be the answer, but if our goal is to get 20% more kids under the age of 14 somewhere, then we can think and be more flexible with the design response is. So anyway, just to flip through some quick visualizations of this, we'll use data to understand what are the peaks and valleys throughout a day, understand the pattern and rhythm of where people are moving and where they're not moving, benchmark cities against one another. So this is an example. In Nashville, for example, we realized there was tons of people on Lower Broadway, if you've ever spent time there, but they were like, it's fine, we can handle it. And we're like, you really have a lot of people walking down here, it's really unpleasant. And so we just pulled out their daily flow of pedestrian activity and just said, let's compare it to San Francisco, New York, and Shanghai. And we realized when we shared that with them is, it's actually not that far off from these other really, really big cities. And just that little data point, we were able to say, hey, San Francisco, New York, and Shanghai, they did all these public realm improvements. They expanded their sidewalk, they closed down a street even. You're squashing people on a kind of a narrow little sidewalk. And just this data point was enough to give the political capital for the city to make a decision to change and actually widen that sidewalk. So again, sort of comparing is sometimes really helpful. Understanding the rhythm and how people move through a space, so tracing people's pathways. Understanding how people mix and interact in a space. So this is more through questioning, through in Intercept surveys, but are people connecting more passively, or are they connecting with a familiar stranger? So someone that you might recognize sort of at a bus stop or a park that you see quite regularly. Do you actually interact with them? Do you talk with them? Understanding how sticky a place is. So this is really figuring out how many people walk by a place versus how many people stay. And so a place might have a lot of people spending time there, but there could be even more people walking by it. And so is the space really performing at its maximum ability? Comparing quality versus use. So this is in Toronto, for example. We just compared two spaces and then compared their quality metrics here. And it just sort of reinforced this idea that these qualities were qualities that we heard from Torontonians about what they want in their public realm. And this example of a park here sort of ticked off all these boxes, and it sees a pretty good, robust 86 people per hour spending time there. Downtown, only a couple of these qualities were ticked off, and it's seeing very few people spending time in comparison in a much busier part of the city. So again, just a way to sort of reinforce that quality matters. If you're designing for what people want, people will stay. Understanding people's relationships to the space, understanding the rhythm of activities throughout the day. So these are different types of activities. So eating, waiting for transit, commerce, just sort of kind of getting an idea of what the rhythm of the day is, and then being able to design according to what different activity mixes are throughout the day. It's helpful. Understanding the density of a space, how much people feel connected to other people, right? So Civic Center in San Francisco, you've got 4 people for every 10,000 square feet, whereas something like Trafalgar Square, you've got 39 people for every 10,000 square feet, or Pier 39, 88 people for 10,000 square feet. So it starts to feel a little bit more connected. Understanding impact of programming. So there's a lot of events, cities do a lot of events, but how is it actually changing the experience of the city? This is an example in Denver where on a typical day, very few people are spending time. They did one event and we just calculated what the increase in activity was, and it was about 100% increase. So you could do an event, but if you didn't capture that data point, it would kind of be like, all right, that was a cool event. But now we can understand that, okay, at this time of day at 4 p.m. when we had our biggest lull, the event actually created its largest impact. Set measures to evaluate long-term change. Just gonna flip through some of these. So anyways, the point here is that these data stories have helped shift the civic culture in some of these cities to make public life a driver for change in a number of cities. And so I want to just tell a couple of stories and a little bit more depth for each of them. So New York, committing to an iterative process. So in New York, pedestrian data helped give the city the confidence to test major public realm changes. So Mayor Bloomberg came in, this is in 2008, and said, okay, we're going to have a greener, greater New York. What does that mean? One thing was we're going to have every New Yorker be, within a 10-minute walk of an open space. So if you think about New York, where are you going to find that space to do that? We went out and we started observing a lot of street space. And if you've been to Times Square before, you would know that this was what it looked like. And we collected some very simple data here. Really what we looked at was space. 90% of the roadway was designated for cars. Only 10% was pedestrian area, right? But when we calculated what the public life use was, 90% of the users were on foot and only 10% of people were in cars. So it was sort of flipped. And we sort of said, hey, there's no square in Times Square. And this data point was enough for the city to say, let's test something. Let's test something in a really cheap way. They went out almost overnight, not quite, got a bunch of chairs from Costco, put them in the space, and what happened? People freaked out. They lost their mind. But it was good, because they were freaking out about stuff like, these chairs suck, or like, we want more shade. So it was an incredible win, because it was no longer a debate over whether we should or shouldn't close the street down. It was now just a conversation on let's get better lawn chairs, which is perfect. If we spent a whole year doing beautiful renderings, trying to say, hey, if you did this, if you close this street off but not that street, or if you turn this off, and then we go in circles and we probably wouldn't get anywhere, all because we're trying to work towards this multi-million-dollar project. There's like too much nervousness around that. So we tested, we listened, we went out and said, all right, let's test some more. Let's try some different iterations on this. Let's put some umbrellas out. Let's try some art. Let's refine it. Let's have some programming in the space. Let's see what it can be. And let's measure again. The key piece is that we don't stop. This public space is sort of always evolving and constantly changing. And what we did was, after a certain period of time, we went back and said, okay, what are the data points here that we can say? There's an 11% increase in pedestrian volume. Amazingly, if that was even possible, the street was already super busy as it was. There was a 35% decrease in pedestrian injuries because people weren't walking into a roadway anymore. 17% decrease in travel time. So actually, a lot of people that were really nervous, taxis that it was going to be harder to get around, actually it regulated the street network a little bit. That there was like a kind of a little bit of an asterisk, and actually improved commute times. Asking people how they felt about it, 74% of people surveyed said it was a dramatic improvement. And then the adjacent businesses saw a 22% increase in economic activity. So it was a fairly significant win-win-win throughout. And those efforts over a period of time allowed the city to have that capital, the political capital, go out and do this big change. If we tried to do this first, it would never happen. And the story isn't done with Times Square, right? I think it's constantly changing, and there's constantly refining that needs to be done with it. So it'll be interesting to go back and continue to evaluate and see how it's doing. But that's a quick story to sort of talk about how data is valuable, but also pairing data with a prototype or pilot project to help understand a specific question is very, very powerful. So in this case, these lawn chairs were a way to try an idea out, but also be a platform for engagement with people. So people could communicate and say what they liked and didn't like about it, and if anything was wrong, we could just pull them out fairly easily. And of course, this sort of scaled up across the city. Times Square was one of 81 new public spaces that they did throughout the city in a similar format. How are we doing on time? Good? Okay. Denver. So Denver's a story about how having a shared experience with the city can really help make change happen. Not unlike New York, but this is a more kind of relatable city in a lot of ways. We're doing work on 16th Street Mall in Denver. Who's been to Denver? Has anybody? Are you familiar with 16th Street Mall a little bit? So this is a historic street, beautiful street, long, 5,300 foot long, 80 foot wide street. It's a pedestrian and transit mall. And it's the city's hardest working transit corridor. It's commuting 45,000 people a day on their free bus ride. It's also seeing 28,000 people walking through the street. So in this way, it's super high functioning. But it's only seeing 1% of people spending time. So what I kind of talked about earlier, the stickiness factor, there's very little stickiness on this street. And so the other piece of this is that walkability isn't enough, right? So a lot of people are walking through it, but all these other elements are not working. So the retail environment is suffering, there's a lot of antisocial behavior, and the other piece to this is that the city is spending over $5 million a year in maintenance repairs, because the street itself, the stones, were not designed to withstand those large buses that the street is now needing to use because the demand is so high for transit. So a change is needed, but they're really nervous about doing any change because it's such an important transit connector. So our thought here was like, okay, similar to the New York thing was what is the incremental approach, the bite-sized approach here to start to make change happen? So we suggested, all right, in one weekend, let's redirect the bus routes off 16th Street on the adjacent streets 15 and 17, just for weekend, one Sunday. Just a kind of quick diagram of that, 8-block segment. And while we're doing this, let's program a lot of public space activities and see what kind of comes of it. So this is a typical day, 16th Street. This was some of the activations that took place on the street. And of course, sort of continuing to collect data, we saw an increase in the number of people spending time there. We saw an increase in the number of families and children spending time on the street. The range of activities, it was just standing and sitting usually, but we're seeing a lot more types of activities. We're getting people kind of lying down. I think another piece that was sort of showing up was that the highlight of activity was expanding throughout the afternoon, whereas before we just had these little spikes. This is a little bit more of a consistent activity throughout the day. And even in spaces that weren't designed or programmed, just sort of spontaneously were kind of taking over with people. So there was a lot of success, we felt at least, right? There's a lot of interesting data coming out of it, but sometimes data isn't enough. And in this case, the assistant general manager of the RTD, which is their transportation department, was concerned. He said, I don't think it's appropriate to experiment with our customers, which is fair. And so in this moment, we sort of needed to kind of be a little bit nimble and say, let's make this an opportunity to have a shared experience. So we did a walk shop with city staff, with him, during one of these events. And this was super important to help change mindset. And by the end, Bruce, he's getting us IPA, he's buying us beer, and he said, I think it's better if we do this every weekend all summer in 2016. So he kind of adopted the idea and actually wanted to go further. His concern originally was that there was sort of a haphazardness to like, let's do this weekend and let's do that day. What he kind of came around to realize that this is an important thing. Transit relies on consistency, so if we can have a consistent sequencing to this, a consistent time frame, that's what will be the unlock for him. So that was super important. And again, the piece to this, the piece with the New York Times Square example, is that it's about this incremental approach to change, and that it's always checking in as you go along. Checking in with data, checking in with people, how it's going. So 2014, a one-day festival. 2015, over 2 days. Then we did the kind of 12 days over the weekend, over the summer. And now we're in the process of doing a kind of capital redesign with them. And so that's a sort of a larger project that's going to take a much longer period of time. But we now have the political support to kind of move through that. There's still going to be challenges throughout, and there's always going to be opportunities to experiment and test and learn, even throughout the kind of capital planning phase. But this is sort of an idea of the steps that it sort of takes to get there. I'll do one more example, Copenhagen, just because I gotta talk about these guys. So the important thing about Copenhagen is that they have taken this approach and really formalized it within their city government. And that's really what's led to the kind of transformation of the city. This bothers us sometimes. If our colleagues in Copenhagen are always saying how great it is. It's amazing. Like, we get it, it's great, okay. Everyone bikes, kids are biking and everything. But this scene didn't happen by accident. It was intentional. It used to be, in the 60s, a car-dominated city, like many North American cities. Just over time, methodically kind of working towards this shared goal. And just some diagrams sort of showing this over time. In 1962, sort of the first pedestrianized street, Then in 73, more of a network started to expand, about 49,000 square meters through streets and squares, but it's part of the network. They're not just sort of disparate. And then in 2019, you can see the kind of overtaking of downtown, or the city center, in pedestrian and bike first city spaces. And that improvement in infrastructure over time has now seen that actually cycling is the #1 way that people get around. Talking about cyclists a little bit more, that accidents have gone down as bicycle activities have gone up. And just to kind of go over this a little bit, these are the documents and the strategies over the course of 50 years that have shaped this transformation. And not to get too in the weeds here about this, but this, for example, gets really specific about targets, public life targets that they're working towards for 2025, right? So 70% of Copenhageners are satisfied with bicycle parking. That's very specific. Right now, it's 33%. So they literally are going through all of these things. There's a tremendous list that they're working towards. But essentially what they kind of boil down to is that more urban life for all. So by 2015, 80% of all Copenhageners will be satisfied with the opportunities they have for taking part in urban life. More people walk, so 20% increase. And then more people stay longer. Pretty simple. I mean, it breaks down into a lot more detail here. But this is sort of the example of a city that has really formalized this. So whereas New York and Denver are examples of cities where they're testing and they're working toward it, this is just an example of if you really make this a concerted effort and you start to set these targets, that's how you start to see long-term change. So that is, I'm flipping backwards, but this is it. This is my presentation.